There are really three sources that served as the impetus for my development of QuickReads. The first were the findings from the 1994 National Assessment, and they came out in 1996, and the National Assessment of Educational Progress included a special study that looked at the rate at which a selected group of students read the texts that they had been measured on in terms of their silent reading comprehension. And this study showed that a substantial proportion of them read very slowly when they were asked to read the text that they had read silently and answered comprehension questions, and that there was a very strong relationship between how you did on the silent reading comprehension and on the oral reading comprehension. The second was when the findings for the National Reading Panel came out, I was interested when they were saying repeated guided reading was important. I was interested in knowing what were the texts that were used in those studies. So was just any text work? So I actually went about, because they hadn't attended to that in the National Reading Panel report, I actually located all of the studies, and I then began locating as many of the texts that I could identify from those studies, or texts that were prototypical of a kind of text that was talked about in a study. And then I went about analyzing all of those texts to say, was there something unique about the text? And in fact, there was. There were only a handful of studies that used trade books. In the studies that showed the effects for fluency interventions, those studies actually used text that had a degree of control. In other words, the 1,000 most frequent words were repeated a substantial number of times in these texts, and they didn't have high percentages of words that fell outside the 1,000 words that weren't repeated, or that in fact were multisyllabic and just appeared a single time. Another source that influenced my thinking was work that I was doing at the Lawrence Hall of Science at the University of California, Berkeley, where we were working on integrating appropriate science texts into inquiry-based science. And when I began analyzing the science texts, it seems obvious to me now, but what I hadn't realized is that in science texts and also in social studies and informational texts, the hard words, words like chemical or reaction or shoreline or organism, those words are actually repeated because the author is communicating something about information. And it turns out when you're writing stories, hard words are often singletons. They appear a single time. Why is that? Because it's not part of the genre of narrative text to keep describing the character in the same way. I use a set of synonyms to describe how the character languished or was tired or was lazy. So I don't keep using that word lazy over and over and again like Dick and Jane did, which was why Dick and Jane were so strange, that genre of text, right? Because those words were repeated over and over again, and you don't do that in stories. So as I talked with teachers around the country about these findings, first of all in the National Reading Panel, and then the work that we were doing on science texts, they kept asking me, but tell us what texts are really good for fluency practice. So when I'm doing these coaching sessions, when I'm doing these short sessions, and the research on the National Reading Panel also showed that in actual interventions and instructional sessions that were effective, they didn't use 1,000-word texts. They used short passages, 50, 100, 200 words at max. So they kept asking, so what text should we use? So what I began doing was analyzing hundreds of texts. And I had no intention to ever begin writing my own text. I mean, I thought, well, this isn't going to take me long. I had a graduate student who developed a text analyzer so I could analyze to see how many times words are repeated, because I'm very interested in not having a lot of these singletons that are hard words. And I began analyzing all the available programs that were purported to help fluency, and I wasn't finding the same characteristics as I'd found on the National Reading Panel text, the texts that were used in the studies of effective fluency instruction. So I began asking myself, if we were to write texts that were like those in the studies in the National Reading Panel, what would those texts be? Now you can ask, well, why not just go back to those texts? Well, it turned out a lot of the studies were done in the 80s and 70s, and they used a lot of the old basals that had the Dick and Jane kind of genre that people have sometimes called primaries, a very stilted kind of genre. And furthermore, a lot of them were stories. And my thinking was, the thing about students who are struggling with fluency isn't just that they have a fluency issue that leads to poor comprehension, but they also don't have a lot of the world knowledge, the background knowledge they need to be proficient readers. So I was interested in, can we actually develop a set of texts that would support background knowledge and vocabulary, get kids thinking and comprehending about meaningful things? I don't want to waste the time of the kids for whom there's a real gap, the achievement gap. I want every minute to count in school. So I began asking, if we took informational texts, so we've been writing these more extended books at the Lawrence Hall, if we took informational texts in topical kinds of ways, so we took a theme and had short passages, 100 words, around that, because that was what the research showed was really effective, could we actually start thinking about what those would look like? One of the things I said is it's important to have it be around information, because that's a natural genre to keep repeating words. And then I began asking, so what would be other characteristics of the text? And it was clear to me from the National Reading Panel findings that it would be good to have texts that were at independent levels. I also believed that it was important to have texts that actually got longer over time, but were attuned to the fluency norms that we know students are reading at. So for a second grader, we're not going to give them a 150-word passage that we'd expect a fifth grader to be reading, but we'd want to give them something that starts at 80 words. Okay, so the passages would be gradually longer to show kids this is typically what kids your age can read in a minute. Now, you might not be able to do this right now, but we're actually going to teach you how to do that, and we're going to keep lengthening the task. So those were some of the sources of how QuickReads came to be. I had always expected that I'd find the text there and I could just start recommending them. And suddenly I found, they're not there. And that led me to the next 3 years of sitting in my house actually doing the background information so we could write texts that would, yes, provide the right words, but also provide the right background knowledge.
Now we'll walk through Dr. Hebert's program and explore how she applied her research to the development of QuickReads. The first feature of the program we'll discuss is the vocabulary in the QuickReads texts. The QuickReads texts consist of a combination of the most frequently used words at each grade level and words with readily decodable phonic and syllabic patterns. About 98% of the words in QuickReads come from this group of words. Of the remaining 2%, each unique word is repeated an average of 4 times within a topic. After she decided on text difficulty, Dr. Hebert turned her attention to the topics she would write about. To find topics that interested students, she turned to science and social studies. Also, to make sure she found topics that would contribute to students' background knowledge and vocabulary, she researched the curricula for those content areas in grades 2 through 6. Next, Dr. Hebert had to figure out how long the texts should be. Again, the research showed her the norms for reading at each grade level. And, as Dr. Hebert said earlier, the NAEP study found that the 4th graders who scored highest read at a rate of at least 130 words per minute. These findings indicated that students should be able to read fluency texts in 1 minute. That length allowed students a manageable goal. It also allowed for rereading. At this point, Dr. Hebert had the instructional framework for QuickReads. She knew that her program needed to help students. increase their background knowledge of critical science and social studies concepts, ensure their automaticity with grade appropriate high-frequency words, strengthen their content area vocabulary through repeated exposure and practice, and improve their understanding of informational text through the use of comprehension strategies. That is the plan that grew into the QuickReads program. After creating the phonics criteria and assembling the high-frequency word list for each QuickReads level, Dr. Hebert worked on the formula for the texts to make sure she would be testing what she wanted to test. She wanted students to want to read and reread the QuickReads texts. Then she wrote the texts and validated them in the classroom. Finally, to make sure she wasn't just serving the needs of a few students, Dr. Hebert and her associates validated the texts and the instructional routine in classrooms around the country. The program that resulted, QuickReads, is available in book form and on the latest speech recognition technology. Dr. Hebert was especially excited to work with her friend and colleague, Dr. Marilyn Jager Adams, on the technology. Dr. Adams's studies confirm that this technology is a great tool for encouraging and motivating students to practice reading in a supportive setting. As Dr. Hebert mentioned earlier, her research showed her that students and teachers benefit from using a strong, clearly understood instructional routine. So, to be sure that QuickReads was a complete fluency program, she created and validated a routine that included directions for optimal use in the classroom. Again, reading research says that students need strategies that show them what to do before, during, and after they read. Dr. Hebert was also aware, from her own teaching experience, that preparation time is a factor in every teacher's day. To address all of these considerations, Dr. Hebert's instructional routine relies on simple metacognitive behavior that students can easily understand and use independently. Basically, students read a passage 3 times and carry out some simple metacognitive activities to be sure they've understood what they've read. During the first read, students think about what they know about the topic before they read a passage. Next, they scan the passage for unfamiliar words. Then they read the passage at their own pace. After reading, students fill out a graphic organizer that helps them identify and remember key points in the passage. The goals of the first read are to help students build on their prior knowledge, work with challenging words, note words and ideas that will help them remember key points. During the second read, students listen to and follow along with a fluent reading of the passage. In the print program, students can listen to an audio recording. The technology edition also allows students to listen to the passages read aloud. After listening, students think about what the author wants them to remember. The goals of the second read are to help students follow a model of a fluent reading, identify the key ideas of the passage, remember key points by noting words and ideas. During the third read, students reread the passage with the goal of completing their reading in 1 minute. Students note how many words they read in a minute. Finally, they answer 2 review questions, which check that students have understood the passage's main points. The goals of the third read are to help students read the passage fluently in 1 minute, check their comprehension of the passage. For some students, it might be valuable to do additional reads. Students can benefit from revisiting the text a 4th or 5th time. The important point to consider is the purpose for rereading. With additional rereadings, the teacher should provide direction to the student. The student may be asked, for example, to read again to share a favorite section with someone else, or the student may be directed to reread in order to connect the information to something previously read. Now put this DVD on pause and pair share for 1 minute about instructional routines you have used. Think about how these routines have clarified your students and your own expectations for what they will do and learn. You may have listed some techniques we've discussed that you've already used in your classroom. You probably have additional ones too. Add to your list as this recording continues. There's so much to fit into a school day these days. That's one reason Dr. Hebert wanted the QuickReads program to be easy for busy teachers to implement. With that in mind, she designed the program to be used for 15 minutes a day. With a simple instructional routine that students can complete independently, students and teachers are much more likely to approach fluency with confidence. Validation studies have shown that using QuickReads for 15 minutes a day helps students make measurable progress. In fact, their reading rate rose more quickly than other students did. And although striving readers see the largest gains, all students demonstrate improvement regardless of their ability or grade level.